Okay, well, thank you, Monica, and good morning to everyone. Obviously a very summer-like morning here, and that's going to be the theme of where we're going. And I want to just start here with to talk about a significant change that's taken place over the last several days. I think everyone can probably appreciate this, but as all these things typically in our part of the world, we have to look at the jet stream in the upper air, and it's worth discussing because it's so different. And on the left-hand side here was the jet stream pattern. This is actually a week ago today, but it's very typical of what we saw for much of the first half of the month of May. And of course, that was for most of us unusually cool, and most places were also very, very dry. And if you look at the feature here, we've got a big carved out over really right over the middle of the Great Lakes, one after another, air masses out of Canada with real cold, dry air. Very, very simple, straightforward type of meteorology there. And again, the result was almost a week of straight frost freeze events, et cetera. Now, contrast that on the right-hand side here, which is the current map, the upper air, and you can see it's been this big trough is completely gone. And not only is it gone, but it's been replaced by a huge upper air ridge. That's this upside down inverted U-shaped feature here. And these in the mid latitudes, these are classic signs. We have sinking or subsidence of air underneath those ridges. They're warmer than normal surface temperatures and typically drier than normal as well. And that basically is where we're at for the next several days. So big changes. And that's I guess the underlying major theme here as we look ahead. Now, in the last week during the transition here, you can see that our mean temperatures for the week range from, a few degrees above normal in the far northern part of the state to a couple degrees below. So again, reflects that transition from unusually cool to unusually warm, which is where we are now. Probably more importantly for most of you, depending on where you are in location, and a lot of that does right now in terms of moisture, but it was another unusually dry week across most of the state. Most of the state had less than a quarter of an inch, and there were large areas in the lower peninsula where it was less than a tenth. So this is one of the drier weeks that we've seen. The drier than normal pattern for some areas in southern and central lower Michigan goes all the way back to late last summer or early fall. Most of the deficits, though, have really counted up or added up here since the last part of February. I'll show you a graphic of that in just a moment. But again, another unusually dry week, which of course is tacked on to other dry weeks. Degree day totals, not a whole lot to talk about here, but it is this note, these are different than some of what I've shown before. These are actually corn 8650 cutoff degree days, which of course is what's used typically by the industry, or at least part of the variety selection process. These start on May 1. And of course, the first 2 weeks of May were unusually cool. So not a surprise here with our degree day totals relative to normal are a little bit below. Now, if we go back to the beginning of March, remember that the early part of the season was warmer or milder than normal. And we actually look at degree days from March 1. There are still surpluses from that time frame through the present, primarily in southern parts of the state. The northern part of the state is basically near to maybe a couple days behind normal. So again, it depends on your frame of reference here. But for our spring planted annuals here crop, this is a May 1 starting date. We're actually running a little bit behind. But also cut ahead to the forecast part. This is going to change dramatically for the next week with much warmer than normal weather here expected for a good chunk of the upcoming week. In terms of soil moisture, further reductions. This is looking at the top 3 feet or so of the soil profile, and you can see very different circumstances here in the state, and that's going to be also part of the forecast. Really, the southern half to 2/3 of lower Michigan is really where we're most concerned about, and this is the area that's been missed repeatedly over the last several weeks, and you can see here with the browns and some darker browns here, indicating that in this variable here, we're not looking at total water. This is plant extractable water for that given soil, however that's classified there. It'd be the predominant soil type. But unfortunately here, what we can see is that some areas now have dropped to less than 20% of normal, or 20% of the potential plant extractable. And in Michigan, again, the issue is We just don't see that. It's very, very unusual in our climate to see that at this time of the year. And we've been looking at the history of the climatology of this, and again, it's an unusual situation, but the situation that leaves us in, of course, is that we're going to have water, more water through precipitation here coming up over the next several weeks as plant and crop water needs and demands increase. That's the challenge. And in most years, we go into the growing season, we have quite a bit of water stored in the soil that can be then counted on later on. This year in this part of the state, we do not. Now, I mentioned depends on where you are. Northern parts of the state have done much better in terms of precipitation. It's not wet by any means, but certainly much better in the Upper Peninsula and in portions of the northern Lower Peninsula than it is in the south. And this similar circumstances as we go south of the border, and I'm sure that you probably all have noticed or observed in the last couple of weeks, there have been at least 3 weather systems here that moved up, low pressure systems out of the Gulf, all sorts of moisture with them, and they got literally to the Michigan border and stopped, or for a number of reasons failed to produce precipitation. Some of that's bad luck, bad timing, but it is unusual for us to see that. And so areas to our south actually are better. The last weather system here, which was the weekend before last, more than 2 inches of rain fell large areas of the eastern Corn Belt. But again, the vast majority of that stayed south of the border, unfortunately. So that sort of leaves us where we are. One other graphic here. This is a representative accumulated precipitation graphic from cold water down in the south central part of the state, and it's typical of that southern third or so of the Lower Peninsula. And what you see here, there's several lines or series on here. The green is the 2021. This is looking at the beginning of January through the middle of May. So there's accumulated rainfall, and you can see that that's down here. The brown is the normal for this particular site. And I've also added here a couple of other ones. The wettest so 4.5 month period here, that's up here in blue, and that happened to be 2009. And then the driest at this site was 1971. That does show up in a lot of comparisons historically, by the way, if you're looking for a dry one. But note here that by the middle of May, which is at the end of this graphic, we're pretty close to the driest one on record, at least at this site. And more importantly, we have a deficit here, a precip deficit, just over 4.5 months of over 6.5 inches. That's a lot of water. Remember, our total annual precipitation at this particular site, probably around 33 inches or so. So it's a big chunk. It's more than a whole normal month's worth of rainfall. It's not something, even hopefully when we do get out of this, it's going to take some time to get out of there, because we have built up a significant deficit. One other thing too, relative, we talked about this just before we started, and that is there's been a long-term upward trend in precipitation in Michigan, a very distinctive trend towards more precip, and a lot of that is in the spring season. So many of certainly the last decade, the spring seasons have been wetter than normal. So now when we do get a drier than normal season here, it seems even worse and some of it is psychological. But that said, if we look at the statistics, this is the driest late winter, early spring we've seen over the southern half of Lower Michigan in at least 20 years. It's been a while. If you want to look at some analog years, we're going to talk more about this in a future virtual breakfast. We're putting some numbers together here. The 80s are a decade to look at, 1984, 86, 87, 88, and in the late 90s and 89. Those were all years that had fairly dry late winters and early springs. If you're interested, 1992 was also, but you have to go back a ways to observe that. So it's been a while. It is very, very unusual, the situation. If it seems unusual, it is because it is historically. Well, let's look at the forecast and look what are our odds. And right now we're in a very, very frustrating situation, because with that upper air change that I mentioned here earlier, there's a huge plume of moisture out of the Gulf of Mexico, but it's just, for most of the state, it's just to our west. You can see that on the weather map here this morning, all these dark greens. And those areas, especially in the Mississippi Valley, and now actually moving to the west into portions of the western Corn Belt, these areas have gotten precipitation over the last couple of days. Some of it's been very, very heavy rain. More than 10 inches of rain has fallen here along portions of the Gulf Coast. But again, this is the kind of weather situation that we want to see to allow moisture to get up here to the upper Midwest and to the Great Lakes region. In this case, because of this big high here, and that's actually part of the circulation clockwise around this with southerly flow, it's just off to our west. The exception in Michigan would be the Upper Peninsula, and they have picked up significant precipitation over the last day and a half, and will continue to do so. But because of this high here and because of a lot of dry air aloft, it's going to have real difficulty making it to the south and east, again, and over the areas that really need it. And we saw a good example of that yesterday. A lot of the precipitation that moved into the state from the south basically vaporized, and most areas got sprinkles or very, very little. The ones that did see any precip, most areas remain dry. That's going to continue over the next several days, unfortunately. And I'll show you the next chance. I think for most of this area that really needs a precip, we're going to have to look at the end of the weekend and into early next week and cross our fingers a little bit. But one other thing I would note about this, and not a moisture, but with this strong, well-established southerly flow, this would be meteorologically, I think, an insect transport potential event here, something to watch, because we're going to have the same flow repeatedly over an extended period of time, over several days. So that's something to watch as well. Chris may want to address that here afterwards. By tomorrow morning, not a whole lot of change. High pressure still entrenched over the eastern U.S. And you can see this again, the corridor of moisture still there. It's still likely raining in the upper peninsula, but dry. It does indicate some scattered showers possible here in the northern lower. That's possible, but it's going to be much more the exception rather than the rule. The other major theme here we haven't mentioned, but it's obvious, especially if you're in the southern part of the state, with being underneath this big upper air ridge, we're going to see our temperatures continue to increase. These are forecast high temperatures for tomorrow, Friday, and well into the 80s over most of the state. We probably, depending on if the cloud cover, if we lose some of the clouds, and even temporarily, we probably will push 90 for a high tomorrow and possibly on Saturday as well. Those right now, that looks like the two warmest days of the next several, but still our normal highs for much of these, many of these areas here are only in the low 70s. So we're going to be a full 15 degrees Fahrenheit above normal for the next few days. Just as importantly, our minimum temperatures, which have been, well, they've been obviously in the 30s last week, but we're now generally in the 50s into the 60s. For a lot of the southern part of the state, they're going to stay in the 60s. So we're going to really, really rack up some degree days here. Marty talked about the phenology of week with that heat. Things are going to happen rapidly. I certainly would think that, especially with the warm overnight temperatures as well. Lots of development, especially given that the first half of May was so quiet because of the cool. So big contrast and changes. By Saturday morning, once again, not a whole lot of change in the weather map. High pressure still now is migrated, notice, a little bit further to the west, down over Kentucky and Tennessee here, still getting that southerly flow over the state. Still some scattered showers in mainly in northern parts of the state, but bring your attention here to this blue cold front. That's the next weather system. That's the one we really want to watch. And to the north of that, notice there's some big blue H's, another Canadian origin air mass up here. This one right now, most of the guidance is suggesting that this big area of high pressure will sink to the south and east. It's going to drive this cold front in really from the northeast to the southwest across the state, beginning late Sunday and into Monday. Just as importantly, and I think even more importantly, this front is progged to move south, probably clear the southern border of the state, and then stall. Very important, because then it will return north as a warm front, another weather feature there with some moisture, and we'll have an additional chance of precipitation as that front moves back north again. Probably, well, maybe continuing even on Monday. It'll be a little cooler on Monday, but then especially Tuesday into early Wednesday as that front slowly makes its way north. So we have an extended period here where we hopefully will pick up some rain. How much is a big question right now. Some of the model guidance is bullish on this and calls for more than half an inch. Other guidance is more wait and see type of thing and is much more conservative. This is actually a forecast from the U.S. Medium range forecast model here as of Sunday night. And the greens here are precipitation out of the model output, but this is exactly that system I just talked about as that backdoor cold front moves again from northeast to southwest across the state, setting off some showers. So right now, officially, at least from the National Weather Service, these are the estimates for the weekly precipitation. You can see that they have sided, the meteorologists here, the forecasters, have sided with some of the drier, more conservative models, and most of the precipitation that falls here, which is almost virtually on a daily basis across the UP over the end of the weekend, while again the south remains dry. There we could see well over an inch of total precipitation, but still less than a quarter of an inch over the south. I'm hoping that this is maybe a little bit conservative. There's certainly the potential is there to pick up more precip early next week, but right now this was the thinking as of a couple of hours ago of where we are. So and as I mentioned earlier, even if we do get precip, it's going to take a while to gradually start to erase some of these deficits. But for most people right now, they just need some precipitation to get things moving. A lot of crops planted, herbicides applied, you name it. We need the water. This is the next best chance. Again, late Sunday and into Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday timeframe. One other piece of this that goes without saying is our temperatures go up to much above normal levels where they are. Now we're going to see jumps in potential evapotranspiration. The water demand part, which has been lacking, of course, with the cool temperatures, is going to increase significantly today, tomorrow, and into the weekend. And we will have some areas, especially in the south, that do probably approach a quarter of an inch. That's the demand. Of course, it's not there, the water in most of those cases, but that is the atmospheric demand. So the bottom line is that there's going to be stress, or certainly the potential for stress there, especially as crops that do have enough water or that are up try to maintain or try to keep water status. It's going to be a challenging early season type environment. In the medium range forecast guidance, some reason for some optimism in terms of moisture. The jet stream pattern here you can see is related to what we saw at the beginning, still ridging over the eastern, central, and eastern part of the U.S. Southwesterly flow aloft, and most of that translates here to normal to above normal mean temperatures. Now, I would note here that it looks like we will see another Canadian origin air mass near the end of the month. So don't be surprised to see at least a few days where it temporarily cools off. But in terms of the longer term means, most of the guidance is at or even a little bit above warmer than normal, and then maybe a little bit more normal as we move into June. There's a brand new ensemble of long lead outlooks that'll be released here actually any minute now within the next hour by the Climate Prediction Center at NOAA. We'll talk about those next week. But more importantly here, most of these models suggest enhanced odds of precipitation, more chances, and actually normal to above normal precipitation totals. And that's wonderful to look at that forecast. They're in agreement for what are the normal conditions, but I would put a caveat on it. Let's see it first to believe it, because many times, and you probably remember this, we've talked about these enhanced probabilities. It hasn't happened for, again, a number of reasons. It just hasn't developed that way especially for the southern half of the state. So we'll cross fingers and hope that is the right direction. But at least, again, there should be more frequent chances for precip. So trying to wrap up, we've had a lengthy discussion here mostly on water and temperature based here, but very summer-like conditions. And again, depending on where you are in the state, if you're in the central and southern part of the state, very different outlook, hot and dry here for the next several days. In the northern part of the state, continuing chance of showers on an almost daily basis, especially for the western half of upper Michigan. Temperatures at least 15 degrees above normal in many areas. And then again, in the south, our next chance for rain right now, we're hoping here for the end of the weekend and into early next week. And as you just saw, that pattern hopefully will continue on beyond that into late May with more frequent chances for precipitation. So I'll stop there with weather. And moving on to introduce our speaker for next week's virtual breakfast on the 27th, we're going to have Scott Bales, who's our MSU dry bean specialist, to come and meet with us. So don't miss that. And with that, I will turn it back over to Monica or to Phil. Thanks.
All right. So it looked like we have a question in here for Jeff. We have a few crops that are near full sunlight interception, wheat and grass hay or alfalfa. What would the potential evapotranspiration be for the next week and the hot days to come next week?
Right, and just did a real quick one on the try to respond to the chat. But the bottom line is it's going to be high. So the numbers here and the two crops I think that Lyndon mentioned were certainly wheat, which is rapidly approaching full canopy, and alfalfa as we approach a first cut. For those, you're going to be up near that potential reference, probably 2/10 to quarter of an inch per day. Now it will be a little bit less than that once we move probably to the maybe to Monday, Tuesday timeframe. But for the next few days, it's going to be in probably pushing a quarter of an inch a day. So very, very high. And again, think about that water storage that we've had. We're already relying on storage for all those crops, and it's limited. So the actual numbers may be less than that, but the 2/10 to quarter an inch would be the potential rate if the water were there. So unusually high for late May.